Good morning. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 9, and before we do so, I thought we might reflect a little bit on some recent chapters that we've read and discussed. Obviously, if we go back to the time of the Revolution, we can talk about, in that context, the creation of the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration is really the most eloquent statement of American values that we have to this day, and remains an inspiration for how we conduct ourselves not only at home but also in the world. The Constitution was an effort to interpret the Declaration, if you will. And of course, the Constitution has been changed and amended over time, and so that interpretation has changed, that interpretation of the Declaration. But it's kind of a nice thought to think of the Constitution as a interpretation of the Revolution's values, of the values of the Declaration of Independence. And let us not forget that there were some who were against the Constitution. They were known as anti-federalists, Patrick Henry being an example of that. Of course, once we have a Constitution, we have a government. We have a new republic. And let us recall that last chapter, chapter 8, dealt with the rise of one of the great political parties known as the Federalist Party. It's a party that we normally associate with Alexander Hamilton. And of course, Alexander Hamilton had a particular interpretation of the Constitution. He had what is oftentimes referred to as a broad or a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And of course, this was the basis for many of the policies that Hamilton tried to put in place. Most famously, his financial reports that yielded things like a national bank. It was against this Federalist vision that we had another political party born, the political party represented by Jefferson and Madison, known as the Democratic Republicans. And of course, these Democratic Republicans took a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They believed that the way to safeguard the values of the Revolution and of the Declaration, which of course Jefferson had written, was to limit the power of the national government. All of this came to a head under the second presidential administration of John Adams, when in the quasi-war with France, Adams signed off on these rather notorious laws known as the Alien Sedition Acts. And of course, the Sedition Act in particular stipulated that one was not able to criticize the government on matters of policy, particularly national security. This, of course, struck Jefferson and Madison as a great betrayal of one of the core values of the Revolution, the right to free speech. And of course, they penned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions as a response to this. Still, the greatest triumph in this partisan warfare that erupted in the 1790s, again, partisan warfare that has to do with competing interpretations of the Constitution, which means, in turn, competing interpretations of the Revolution and the Declaration. The culmination of this was, of course, what we discussed at the very end of Chapter 8 last time, and that is the Revolution of 1800. And so it is with Chapter 9 that we begin with Jefferson's presidency, who, of course, was the beneficiary of the Revolution of 1800. He was the one that would take the presidency and try and put it onto a new course, now that the Federalist era of American politics, that first decade, was effectively over. What else was happening with the United States as we get into the chapter itself? Well, rapid growth was taking place in the United States. If we consider just the growth that took place in cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore, the population was really booming. And of course, while the United States remained overwhelmingly agricultural, there was a lot of development in trade and manufacturing, something that Hamilton had tried to stimulate with some of his policies as a Federalist in the Treasury Department under the Washington administration. Of course, the other thing that was really capturing the attention was westward migration, as it always has. America has always been about, particularly in this time, about exploration and exploration of the West. And we will see that with that comes some issues regarding transportation and infrastructure, the need to link the West with the East. And that will be very, very important. In fact, it will be trying to settle how to connect the country, geographically speaking, that will actually provide the basis for a whole new round of political squabbling over the proper role and the size and scope of government. What was Jefferson all about? What was his revolution all about? And was it really that revolutionary? Well, Jefferson certainly set a different tone when it came to taking the power, the reins of power in Washington. Jefferson was particularly worried about the development of modern cities. He felt that you would have a bunch of propertyless people that would be crowded into the cities, and he was very, very concerned about this. Jefferson felt that the best type of American would be one who owned their own piece of land and served as a yeoman farmer, was his great phrase, and that as long as the country was expanding west, that we would create what he called an empire of liberty. Of course, this meant that Native Americans and others were going to have to yield to this great bout of American expansion. But generally speaking, Jefferson said that this would be positive because we would find a way to spread American civilization, and what could be better than the spread of American civilization and the values of small r republicanism. Jefferson was someone who was very cautious about the development of the Industrial Revolution and the development of factory life in America. Remember, Hamilton had been an enthusiast. Jefferson was very wary of such things. He thought that factories kind of pointed in the wrong direction. But of course, Jefferson had to accommodate the development of a more modern economy, and he does. By and large, he'll have to yield on that. Nonetheless, we do see that Jefferson will install as his Treasury Secretary someone very different than what we had in Alexander Hamilton under Washington. And this gentleman's name was Albert Gallatin. He was a Secretary of the Treasury that effectively implemented what we might call today an austerity budget, which is there were cuts in the armed services, the Navy, and of course the Army to a degree. And of course, remember that the Army was not very big at the time. In fact, it's going a bit far to even call it an army. But generally speaking, the naval program that the Federalists had implemented was scaled back. And so there were some real cuts to government, is kind of the point that I want to underscore here. Jefferson did deliver on that promise. Of course, Jefferson couldn't do much about the branch of government that the Democratic Republicans did not have control over, and that's the judiciary. In the judiciary, we'll see that the Federalists had done a good job of packing the courts. Particularly, we'll see that John Adams, as one of his final acts, was to appoint what are known as midnight judges, which are basically judges that were given their appointments at the very last moment before Adams left office and Jefferson took over. And of course, at the head of the court is going to be one of the great rivals of Thomas Jefferson, a distant cousin no less, and that will be John Marshall. And John Marshall is an absolute genius in terms of using his own interpretation of the Constitution to advance the political power of the court, the clout of the court. And of course, the thing that will define Marshall's Chief Justiceship in the early going is, of course, the famous case Marbury v. Madison, where one of the appointments that Adams had been Adams had put into place was disputed by the Secretary of State, James Madison. That is to say that he refused to grant the commission to Mr. Marbury. Marshall took a look at this case and threw it out, basically saying that the court didn't have the power to deal with it. And yet, before he threw it out, he said that the reason that the court didn't have the power to deal with it is because the law itself that would have enabled the court to have power was unconstitutional. And the reason why that's significant is because the case of Marbury v. Madison establishes the power of judicial review for the court. So while John Marshall didn't do much in terms of helping a fellow Federalist like William Marbury, he does establish the power that the Supreme Court still has to this day, which is that is the branch of government that is allowed to interpret the Constitution, which is a very, very powerful power. Might make the Supreme Court over time the most strongest branch. Some really do believe that these days, as we oftentimes over the summer are eagerly awaiting what the court's rulings are on actions of both the President and the Congress. Of course, Jefferson's presidency was not just about yielding to the judiciary. There were many successes, and of course the great success was in dealing with the purchase of Louisiana from France, which of course doubled the size of the country and would allow for the great expedition of Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery. It is important to note that at the very same time that we were expanding Jefferson's concept of the Empire of Liberty, we were also, and this is very much connected, ignoring the plight of the slave rebellion in Haiti. Toussaint Louverture and the rebellion that took place against the French in Haiti is something that we will largely ignore, and it is a bit of a blot. Actually, it's more than a bit. It's a real blot on Jefferson's record as someone who was interested in the idea of spreading the concept of democratic revolution to the rest of the world. Nonetheless, if we focus back on the Louisiana Purchase, it's important to note what the book says here, that one of the great beneficiaries of the Lewis and Clark expedition would be, of course, fur companies. And I want you to remember that, because fur companies out in the West, when we think of John Jacob Astor and folks like that, will actually become the first real kind of millionaires in America. And of course, this will lead to the development over time of what we might consider an aristocracy of wealth, which, just as a long-term question, is, does an aristocracy of wealth undermine our commitment to democratic equality? These are great thoughts, and it's important to realize that, of course, Lewis and Clark are the trailblazers in getting us to move into the West. Of course, one of the things that we will see is that Lewis and Clark will become kind of another instance of kind of the scientific exploration and the scientific value of American civilization, and something very much worth considering when it comes to just their contribution to overall history, not just American history. Now, Hamilton will be killed in a duel by the rival, one of his great political rivals, Aaron Burr. And of course, this goes back to some real disputes between the two, including the election of 1800. It is with the demise of Hamilton that we see some of the energy really drain out of the Federalist Party. Of course, the Federalists will maintain their strength in the judiciary, as we just alluded to. But the idea is that the Federalists will no longer have the kind of power that they once did. They'll become very much a regional party up in the Northeast. And of course, it is going to be tough times for the Northeast, because as Napoleon rises in power in France and begins to have the great contest, imperial contest with Britain in the Napoleonic Wars, we will see that this will have an enormous effect on trade. We will basically be kicked back and round again by Britain and France, and we'll have our trade interdicted in the sense that sometimes our ships were seized, our sailors were oftentimes seized, oftentimes the British in a policy known as impressment, in which they would press sailors into the British Army, which, if you think about it, if you're an American sailor, that's a particularly poor fate. And of course, the idea was what to do about it. Well, Jefferson, who of course was not a militarist, is going to be really, in a tough spot. And so the only way that he knows to deal with the problem of Britain and France is to embark on a policy known as the Embargo Act, which is to basically cut off trade with Britain and France. Of course, cutting off trade with Britain and France is going to absolutely cripple the Northeast, and if they didn't have cause already, owing to their Federalist allegiance, if they didn't have cause already to hate Jefferson, boy, did they really hate him after the Embargo Act of 1807. And so we will see that there is an enormous effect on the American economy. After all, even the Southern economy was hardwired into what happened in the Northeast as we begin to see textile mills take off as a result of the cotton production in the South. Well, this is how Jefferson goes out of office. Jefferson, who was supposed to initiate a revolution of sorts, actually, supplied the country with a very modest, administration. Yes, Jefferson did try to cut the size and the scale of government to institute a new frugality, if you will. We see that with the cuts to the military. Nonetheless, Jefferson is willing to go against his own strict constitutional principles when he purchases the Louisiana Territory, which of course required that we treat it as if it had been a treaty between France and the United States. Treaties normally follow wars, but we fudged that one a little bit so that there could be the authority to purchase the Louisiana Territory. You might say Jefferson was acting very Hamiltonian there in his loose interpretation of the Constitution. Of course, the Federalists had retained power by way of John Marshall in the courts, and of course the very important case of Marbury v. Madison establishing the principle of judicial review. And Jefferson, when having to deal with foreign affairs, while he was effective in at least one area, dealing with the Barbary pirates who affected our trade off the course of North Africa, was totally ineffective in dealing with Britain and France, and caused the great enmity of New England against him. They really began to hate him. Of course, there was still enough strength in the Democratic Republicans, which of course typically gained all the votes of new Westerners coming into the country, to have the next president be a Democratic Republican, James Madison. And of course, Madison is going to try and deal with the problem with France and Britain by repealing the embargo and replacing it with the Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act was essentially reopening trade with Great Britain and France. But of course, that didn't stop the problems that we had with Britain and France going against our trade, and so that will be eventually replaced with what is known as Macon's Bill number 2, which was the idea of kind of trying to play the two sides off of each other. If Britain did something nasty to our trade, we would cut off trade with them and just trade with the French. But if the French did something nasty, we would cut off trade with them and trade with the British. And unfortunately, this was not much of a policy. And so the press really began in the country, particularly with war hawks in Congress, that we had to settle this problem with Britain and France militarily. particularly with the British, because the British had not honored some of their obligations under the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to leave their forts in the West, and they were oftentimes seen as kind of instigating Native Americans to attack the United States, and we certainly will see this when it comes to Tecumseh and the Prophet that lead this great rebellion against the Americans in the West. This will eventually be put down by William Henry Harrison in the Battle of Tippecanoe. But the idea that the British were behind these Native American attacks, the fact that the British were continuing to interfere with our trade, really made the case for war as far as many congressmen were concerned. War hawks, famous war hawks, would be people like Henry Clay and, of course, John Calhoun, who, of course, were essentially pushing for not only war against Britain, but also an invasion of Canada. And that is eventually where Madison will go. He will fight what becomes known as Mr. Madison's War. And it's a disaster. Not only are we completely out of our element in trying to attack Canada, but we will see that the British really have their way with us when they march right into Washington, D.C. and burn the Capitol, including the White House, to the ground. Eventually peace will be worked out because the British will realize that it simply isn't worth it to attack the United States in this way. They certainly didn't have the idea of reconquering the United States. So the idea is for both sides, both the Americans and the British, to kind of go back to normal. But the war was absolutely humiliating. And had it not been for the greatest battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, which actually occurs after the war is over, if you can believe it or not. It's a very strange war, the War of 1812. If it had not been for the Battle of New Orleans with the great hero Andrew Jackson, then we probably would have really suffered a national shame. There was certainly a lot of dissension within the country, including in the Northeast, where folks who had never liked Madison and Jefferson and all those Virginians ruling the country, created what became known as the Hartford Convention, which even considered the idea of secession. So well before we ever get any talk of secession in the South, say in the run-up to the Civil War, we actually have, in the context of the War of 1812, we have the concept of secession in the Northeast, in New England. And of course, after the Great Battle of New Orleans, which occurs after the treaty was concluded, the Treaty of Ghent, to end the war, after that great smashing success of Andrew Jackson over the British in New Orleans, it becomes known that the former Federalists, the folks in New England, had entertained the idea of secession, and I mean that party is just written off as politically dead, because after all they were seen to be great traitors. And of course Jackson's victory and the idea that we had survived the War of 1812 became this great kind of celebration of American nationalism, that we had survived a second war of independence against Britain, that we had done it largely on our own. And while a lot of that was just kind of propaganda, the idea that the War of 1812 signals a greater sense of independence for the United States and a little bit more of a commercial set of agreements with Great Britain, that's true. And of course Napoleon had been defeated by this time as well, so the French threat receded as well. Well, what's going on in the wake of the War of 1812? Well, a lot of dynamic innovation in the economy. Remember, the title of the book is Inventing America, and they don't want you to forget it. The authors don't. So they talk about a lot of the development of the American economy, what we would call the American Industrial Revolution, or at the very least the market revolution that takes hold of America. We've already discussed the textile industry, linking the South with the North and that taking off. We could also talk about the introduction of steam power. And of course, it will be the steamboats that will come to define a lot of what America is about in the early 19th century. As the book says, more than any other conveyance, the steamboat hastened the movement of white settlers into Indian territory, and as such served as a vehicle of conquest as well as economic change. So when we talk about the push into the West, the steamboat is absolutely critical. And since we are residents of St. Louis, we all know the importance of the steamboats, I hope, in shaping the destiny of our city. Of course, there were other things that were happening that were taking off in America. We begin to see that there is a lot more interest in the idea of innovation, going beyond even the steam engine, but using a lot of steam power to power factories and the increased mechanization of the United States. We will see this particularly in the Northeast, as you might expect, because there we have, of course, a very kind of commercial mindset. Remember, that's exactly what Hamilton was trying to stimulate by way of the government, was this commercial mindset in the Northeast. Well, it tended to happen by and large on its own, but generally, when we talk about the Lowell factory system that takes place just outside of Boston and New England, this will become very, very important, and we will see that it's the textile industries that will become very, very critical to the development of America and American success. And of course, one thing to note here is that as we pull away from the War of 1812, and as we begin to develop into a more modern, you might say even quasi-industrialized country, we begin to see that each area of the United States plays a different role. The South will supply raw materials like cotton. They'll do so with slave labor, which kind of implicates the entire United States, by the way, not just the South. The West will become the great breadbasket, and of course it will be the Northeast that will be the manufacturing hub. And so there is this attempt by a lot of folks, and we'll see this with Henry Clay in particular, to essentially create a more systematic kind of hardwiring of connections between the different sections of the country. And this is largely because of the notion that economically it's already happening. So the thought was, if we could connect these sections of the country, the North, the South, the West, with better infrastructure problems, perhaps federally funded infrastructure problems, that we could promote a real spirit of nationalism. Not only had we faced down our great former adversary, Great Britain, in the War of 1812, even though effectively the British had given up on their own, but we could still claim it a victory given what Andrew Jackson did at New Orleans. Not only had we faced down our foreign foes to some degree, but we had also begun to see the takeoff, the economic takeoff of the United States, in the regional specialization that would come. And the notion was we should put all that together politically so that we could create a stronger nation. This will be the dream of Henry Clay and what is known as the American system. We'll be dealing with that in the future. Of course, what Henry Clay will realize, and what we should realize as students, is that as much as the country may have been connected economically, and as much as the country may have felt a certain feeling of nationalism following the War of 1812, and even kind of embraced almost one-party rule, if you think about the Democratic Republicans, folks like Madison and then Monroe and others, what is referred to in the history as the era of good feelings. Despite all that seemed to indicate that the country was really, really connected and kind of moving into this age of improvement, there are huge regional differences. The South is a very different country from what we will see in the North, which is a very different country from what we will see in the West. And it is this sectionalism that will eventually cause the Civil War, this sectional divide. And it's very powerful stuff. And as much as we see folks trying to embrace national policies to deal with the specter of sectionalism, say Henry Clay, or just new political ideologies to deal with the specter of sectionalism, say Andrew Jackson later on with his presidency and the formation of the Democratic Party, it's just not going to work. Certainly by the time that we expand further to the west with things like the Mexican War, we will find that sectionalism just cannot be overcome, that it is very difficult to keep this republic together and to keep it kind of on the same page. And yet that was the dream that never died, and of course will eventually be forged through the tumult of the Civil War. This notion of union and this notion of nationalism. And so on that note, we'll end with chapter 9 and look forward to chapter 10, and in particular, what represents part 3 of this textbook entitled A Culture of Improvement, the idea that America could kind of grow up and become more modern and embrace more modern ideas. This will all be very powerful stuff when it comes to looking at what will be known as the Age of Jackson, the 1820s and 30s. Okay, till next time, thank you very much. Have a good day.